What forbidden archaeological discoveries are locked away from the public forever? Story 1. The tomb of Alexander the Great is one of those archaeological mysteries that feels almost impossible when you really think about it. This was arguably the most famous man on Earth during his lifetime. He conquered huge chunks of the known world before turning 33, founded cities everywhere, and basically reshaped history permanently. And then his body just vanished. Ancient writers claimed his tomb was in Alexandria and that it was insanely elaborate. Roman emperors supposedly visited it like it was a tourist attraction. Julius Caesar may have seen it. Augustus allegedly stood over the coffin personally. Then somewhere along the line, the trail completely disappears. What's wild is that Alexandria is one of the most heavily built over ancient cities on Earth. Modern buildings sit on top of ancient ruins, and huge portions of the old city are underwater now because of earthquakes and subsidence. There are literally entire palaces and temples sitting at the bottom of the harbor. So there's a very real chance Alexander's tomb is either buried under apartment blocks, under streets nobody would ever tear up, or sitting underwater somewhere nobody can properly excavate. And honestly, I wouldn't even be shocked if somebody already found evidence of it quietly and kept it under wraps. A discovery like that would instantly become one of the biggest archaeological finds in human history. Governments, museums, historians, nationalists, everybody would start fighting over ownership immediately. It's just crazy that one of the most important humans to ever live could still be lying in some hidden chamber nobody has opened in over 2,000 years. Story 2. The missing tomb of Genghis Khan feels less like an archaeological mystery and more like an actual historical curse. This was the man who built the largest contiguous empire in human history, conquered enormous parts of Asia and Europe, and changed the course of civilization forever. And yet nobody knows where he was buried. According to Mongol tradition, Genghis Khan wanted his burial site kept completely secret. The stories surrounding it are honestly insane. Some legends claim the soldiers escorting his body killed anyone who saw the funeral procession. Then those soldiers were supposedly killed too to preserve the location forever. Other stories say horses were driven across the burial site repeatedly to erase every trace of disturbed ground, and somehow it worked. For centuries, nobody has been able to find the tomb. Not historians, not governments, not massive archaeological expeditions using satellites and ground-penetrating radar. Mongolia even restricted certain searches for years because the site is considered culturally sacred. The weird part is that a lot of historians genuinely believe the tomb may still be untouched somewhere in the Mongolian wilderness. And if that's true, it could contain unimaginable artifacts and historical information from the height of the Mongol Empire. But honestly, part of me thinks people almost don't want it found. There's something eerie about the idea that one of the most powerful conquerors in history successfully disappeared from the world after death so completely that modern technology still can't locate him. In a world where satellites can map almost every inch of Earth, the fact that Genghis Khan's grave might still be hidden out there, untouched, feels bizarrely impressive. Story 3. The Lost City of Akkad is one of those archaeological mysteries that feels almost unreal once you realize how important it was supposed to be. This wasn't some tiny, forgotten settlement in the desert. Akkad was the capital of the Akkadian Empire, one of the first major empires in human history, founded by Sargon of Akkad around 4,000 years ago, and nobody knows where the city actually was. Think about how insane that is for a second. Historians know the empire existed. They have tablets talking about Akkad constantly. Ancient kings bragged about conquering it. Mesopotamian records describe it as this massively important political and economic center. But the city itself? Gone. Completely missing. Archaeologists have spent decades trying to figure out its location somewhere in modern-day Iraq. But unlike places such as Babylon or Nineveh, Akkad has never been conclusively identified. There are theories that it's buried beneath another city, destroyed by flooding from the Tigris or Euphrates, or simply lost under thousands of years of shifting sediment and human construction. And honestly, Iraq's modern history hasn't helped either. Wars, instability, looting, and restricted excavation zones have made large-scale archaeological work incredibly difficult in areas where Akkad might actually be located. The creepy part is realizing there are probably enormous ruins from one of humanity's first great civilizations just sitting underground somewhere unnoticed. Imagine an entire imperial capital buried beneath farmland, desert, or a modern town, while people casually drive over it every day without realizing they're crossing streets built before the pyramids were ancient. Story 4. The Lost Amber Room is one of those stories that sounds fake until you realize it actually happened. People literally called it the eighth wonder of the world. The entire room was covered in amber panels, gold leaf, mirrors, and insanely elaborate decorations inside the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg. Then World War II happened, and the room basically vanished off the face of the earth. German forces dismantled the Amber Room piece by piece after invading the Soviet Union and shipped it to Königsberg, where it was displayed for a while. After that, everything gets murky. As the war collapsed and cities were bombed into rubble, the room disappeared completely, and people have been obsessing over it ever since. There are endless theories. Some think it was destroyed during bombing raids. Others believe it was packed onto ships or trains and hidden in underground bunkers, caves, or secret vaults somewhere in Europe. Every few years, somebody claims they found a hidden German treasure cache that might contain pieces of it, but nothing major has ever turned up. That's what makes the whole thing so fascinating. The Amber Room wasn't just stolen gold or artwork. It was an entire masterpiece room that vanished during one of the most chaotic periods in human history. And honestly, there's a decent chance parts of it are still sitting somewhere untouched behind a collapsed tunnel wall or inside some forgotten storage chamber. Nobody's opened since the 1940s. The fact that one of the most famous treasures in history could still technically be hidden underground somewhere is just wild to think about. Story 5. The disappearance of the original Peking Mani fossils is one of the most frustrating archaeological mysteries ever, because these weren't just artifacts, they were some of the most important human fossils ever discovered. Back in the early 1900s, archaeologists excavating Zhoukoudian Cave uncovered the remains of what became known as Peking Man, ancient Homo erectus individuals dating back hundreds of thousands of years. And not just a few bones either. The site contained remains from over 40 individuals, along with tools, evidence of fire use, and huge clues about early human evolution. At the time, it was one of the biggest paleoanthropological discoveries on Earth. Then World War II happened, and the fossils basically vanished. As Japan advanced into China, there were plans to move the original fossils out of the country for safekeeping. They were supposedly packed into crates and placed under the protection of the United States Marine Corps for transport. And after that, nothing. The crates disappeared somewhere amid the chaos of war. People have spent decades trying to figure out what happened. Some think the fossils were sunk aboard a ship. Others believe they were stolen, destroyed, buried, or sitting forgotten in some military warehouse, mislabeled for generations. The creepy part is that scientists still only have casts and photographs of many of the originals. The actual fossils some of the most important evidence of ancient human ancestry ever found are simply gone. Imagine losing irreplaceable remains from humanity's deep past because the world fell into war at exactly the wrong moment. Story 6, The Lost Heimdaller Galder, is one of those tiny fragments of history that weirdly haunts people once they learn about it. We know it exists. Medieval writers referenced it directly. A surviving line from the poem is even quoted in other Norse texts. But the actual poem itself is gone completely. And what makes it especially frustrating is that it supposedly focused on Heimdall, one of the most mysterious gods in Norse mythology. Heimdall is already kind of an enigma compared to figures like Odin or Thor. He guards the Rainbow Bridge, needs less sleep than a bird, can hear grass growing, and is destined to fight Loki during Ragnarok. Yet huge parts of his mythology feel missing. That's why the disappearance of Heimdaller Galder bugs so many historians and mythology nerds. It might have contained details about Heimdall's origins, rituals, or stories that simply don't survive anywhere else. And honestly, there's a decent chance the poem was never fully written down in the first place. A lot of Norse mythology survived through oral tradition for centuries before medieval Icelandic scribes recorded fragments of it. Entire poems, sagas, and myths were probably lost simply because nobody transcribed them before storytellers died or Christianity gradually replaced older traditions. But there's also the more mysterious possibility. Some manuscripts absolutely were destroyed, altered, lost in fires, or deliberately discarded over centuries. Medieval texts vanished constantly. Libraries burned, pages were reused, monks scraped old parchment clean to write new material over it. So, somewhere out there, it's possible a surviving copy still exists unnoticed in a private archive, buried in an untranslated manuscript collection, or hidden beneath later writing on ancient parchment. And honestly, discovering it today would probably be one of the biggest mythology finds in decades. Story 7, The Lost Tomb of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, feels like one of those historical mysteries that's somehow even more tragic, because it involves two of the most famous people in the ancient world disappearing almost completely after death. Ancient writers claim the two were buried together after their suicides following Octavian's conquest of Egypt. Considering how obsessed ancient rulers were with legacy and symbolism, their tomb was probably incredibly elaborate. We're talking gold, inscriptions, treasures, ceremonial architecture, the whole thing, and yet nobody has ever definitively found it. Most theories place the tomb somewhere near Alexandria, which honestly makes the search almost impossible. Ancient Alexandria has been wrecked repeatedly over the centuries by earthquakes, tsunamis, rising sea levels, war, and urban expansion. Huge portions of the original city literally collapsed into the Mediterranean long ago. Entire palaces, temples, statues, and royal districts are underwater now. That's the crazy part people forget. Some of the most important locations from the ancient world are sitting beneath the harbor, buried under mud, stone, and centuries of debris. Marine archaeologists have found incredible ruins underwater there already. Giant statues, columns, and submerged royal structures. So there's a very real chance Cleopatra and Antony's tomb is down there somewhere too. And honestly, if it is underwater beneath layers of collapsed ruins and sediment, there's a decent possibility it may never be fully recovered. Even if archaeologists locate the general area, excavating submerged ancient structures safely is unbelievably difficult and expensive, which is kind of eerie when you think about it. Two of history's most famous lovers may still be lying together beneath the Mediterranean, while modern ships pass over them every day without realizing it. Story 8. The idea of a second Viking settlement somewhere in North America beyond Lance aux Meadows honestly feels less like a conspiracy and more like something archaeologists quietly expect to eventually find. Lance aux Meadows already proved the Norse reached North America around 500 years before Columbus. That alone completely changed history when it was confirmed in the 1960s. But the weird part is that the site itself looks more like a temporary outpost or staging area than a massive long-term colony. And the Old Norse sagas describe more activity than just one tiny settlement. They talk about places called Vinland, Markland, and Helluland. They mention voyages farther south where grapes supposedly grew naturally, forests with valuable timber, encounters with indigenous peoples, and expeditions involving multiple ships. It really doesn't sound like the Norse just landed once, built a few huts, and immediately left forever. So, where's the rest of it? That's the mystery. A lot of archaeologists think additional Norse camps or settlements almost certainly existed somewhere along the northeastern coastline of North America, but simply haven't been found yet. The Atlantic coast is massive, heavily forested, constantly eroding, and in many places sparsely excavated archaeologically. Plus, Viking settlements weren't giant stone cities. Many structures were built from wood and turf, meaning after 1,000 years, they can become almost invisible unless conditions preserve them perfectly. And honestly, there's something creepy about that. There could literally be buried Norse ruins sitting beneath forests, farmland, or coastal sediment somewhere in Canada or New England while nobody realizes it. The really wild part is that every few years, archaeologists do uncover hints, strange artifacts, possible turf structures, bits of worked metal, but never enough evidence to confirm a second colony conclusively. It genuinely feels less like if another site existed and more like archaeologists just haven't stumbled onto it yet. Story 9, the lost crown jewels of King John of England, are one of those historical stories that sound almost made up because the way they vanished was so bizarre. According to medieval accounts, in 1216, King John was traveling through eastern England during a period of civil war and absolute chaos. While crossing an area known as the Wash, a huge tidal estuary full of mudflats and fast-moving tides, part of his baggage train supposedly became trapped. And not just random supplies. The carts allegedly carried the royal treasury, crown jewels, gold, silver, relics, and priceless royal possessions. The whole thing sank into the mud and disappeared. If true, it means some of the most valuable treasures in medieval England may still be buried somewhere beneath layers of silt and marshland over 800 years later. And the frustrating part is that nobody even knows exactly where it happened. The geography of the Wash has changed massively over the centuries. Coastlines shifted, rivers moved, land was reclaimed, and huge amounts of sediment built up over time. Areas that were underwater in King John's day are dry land now, while other regions have completely transformed. Treasure hunters have been obsessed with finding the lost hoard for centuries. People have searched the mudflats with metal detectors, historical maps, and excavation equipment, hoping to uncover even a fragment of the treasure. Nothing definitive has ever turned up. And honestly, there's something weirdly eerie about the idea that England's medieval royal treasure may still be sitting underground somewhere beneath cold marshland, while cows casually graze above it. The fact that an entire king's fortune could vanish because somebody misjudged a tidal crossing just feels like the most medieval disaster imaginable. Story 10. The lost tomb of Attila the Hun feels like the kind of burial story that's half history and half myth, which honestly just makes it even creepier. According to ancient accounts, when Attila died in 453 AD, his followers gave him an incredibly elaborate secret burial. The stories claim he was placed inside 3 coffins nested together, one of iron or lead symbolizing war, one of silver symbolizing wealth, and one of gold representing his immense power. Then things get even darker. The Huns supposedly diverted part of a river, often said to be connected to the Danube River or nearby tributaries, buried Attila beneath the riverbed, and then allowed the water to flow back over the site to erase every trace of the grave. And according to legend, the workers involved in the burial were executed afterward, so nobody could ever reveal the location, which, terrifyingly enough, may have worked. More than 1,500 years later, nobody has conclusively found Attila's tomb. Not a single confirmed royal grave, treasure chamber, or burial complex tied directly to him has ever been uncovered, despite his enormous historical importance. And honestly, there's something weirdly fitting about that. Attila terrified huge portions of Europe during his lifetime. Entire cities feared his approach. Roman writers practically described him like an apocalyptic force of nature. The idea that his burial place was hidden so completely it effectively vanished from history almost feels intentional, like the Huns wanted him to become legend rather than just another dead ruler. The really eerie part is that if the stories are even partly true, his tomb could still be sitting untouched underground, somewhere beneath layers of river sediment with its treasures completely intact. An entire royal burial erased by water and silence. Story 11. The idea of undiscovered plague pits beneath ancient Constantinople is honestly one of the creepiest archaeological possibilities out there, because it's almost guaranteed they exist somewhere under the modern city. Back in the 6th century, the plague of Justinian absolutely devastated the Byzantine Empire. Contemporary accounts describe entire districts overwhelmed with corpses faster than people could bury them. Some writers claimed thousands were dying every single day at the height of the outbreak. And Constantinople was one of the biggest cities on Earth at the time. There's no way all those dead received careful, individual burials forever. At some point, mass graves almost certainly became necessary. Emergency burial pits, trenches, hastily sealed chambers, something. The weird part is that modern Istanbul sits directly on top of all of it. That city has been continuously inhabited for something like 2,600 years. Every empire built over the ruins of the last one. Roman layers beneath Byzantine layers, beneath Ottoman layers, beneath modern streets and apartments. Archaeologists constantly stumble onto insane discoveries there, accidentally during subway construction or rescue excavations. Entire ancient harbors, churches, cisterns, skeletons, forgotten tunnels. So honestly, the odds are incredibly high that plague pits from the Justinian pandemic are still sitting untouched underground, somewhere beneath parking garages, roads, or apartment blocks. And when they eventually are found, it'll probably happen by accident. Some construction crew digging foundations are suddenly going to hit mass graves filled with hundreds of skeletons from one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that modern people in Istanbul might walk over buried catastrophe sites every day without even realizing it. Story 12. The lost city of Mabila is one of those archaeological mysteries that feels unbelievably important considering how little people talk about it. Back in 1540, Hernando de Soto marched through what's now the southeastern United States looking for wealth and territory. Eventually, his expedition entered Mabila, a heavily fortified indigenous settlement somewhere in present-day Alabama. And then everything exploded into chaos. The Battle of Mabila was apparently an absolute slaughterhouse. De Soto's forces were nearly wiped out after local warriors trapped them inside the settlement and launched a massive coordinated attack. Contemporary accounts describe fires, barricades, hand-to-hand fighting, and thousands of deaths. Some historians honestly think the expedition came dangerously close to complete annihilation there, which makes it crazy that nobody knows exactly where the city was. Archaeologists have spent decades trying to pin down Mabila's location, using old expedition records, river systems, artifact trails, and now LiDAR scanning. And LiDAR honestly feels perfect for this kind of search, because so many Mississippian settlements left subtle earthworks, defensive walls, mounds, and landscape modifications hidden beneath forests or farmland. The creepy thing is that the site could still contain incredible evidence from one of the most violent clashes between Europeans and indigenous civilizations in early North American history. Burn layers, Spanish armor fragments, weapons, human remains, entire fortifications. And because southeastern landscapes have changed so much over the centuries through farming, logging, erosion, and development, the ruins may just look like random terrain unless you're analyzing them carefully from above. Honestly, discovering Mabila would probably rewrite huge parts of what people understand about early colonial encounters in North America. Story 13, the story of the lost army of Cambyses II, is one of those ancient mysteries that sounds so dramatic it almost feels fictional, which honestly makes sense because the main source is Herodotus, a guy famous for mixing real history with stories that occasionally sound completely insane. According to Herodotus, around 524 BC, Cambyses sent an army of roughly 50,000 Persian soldiers into Egypt's western desert to destroy the famous Siwa oasis, after priests there supposedly refused to recognize his authority. The army marched into the desert and vanished. Herodotus claims they were swallowed by a gigantic sandstorm somewhere along the route, buried so completely that neither the men nor their equipment were ever seen again, which is honestly terrifying to picture. Imagine tens of thousands of soldiers disappearing into one of the harshest environments on Earth, with no survivors and almost no trace. And the weird part is that people have genuinely searched for them for centuries. Explorers, archaeologists, and desert expeditions have all tried to locate evidence of the missing force. Every so often, somebody claims they found bones, weapons, campsites, or artifacts that might belong to the lost army, but nothing has ever conclusively proven the story true. Still, the Sahara absolutely can erase things frighteningly well. Entire caravans disappeared historically, sand dunes shift constantly, buried sites can remain hidden for thousands of years. So even if Herodotus exaggerated the numbers or details, it's not impossible. Some military expedition genuinely vanished out there. And honestly, there's something deeply unsettling about the idea that somewhere beneath the Egyptian desert, thousands of ancient soldiers could still be lying exactly where the storm buried them 2,500 years ago. Story 14. The Lost Forts from Juan Pardo's expeditions through the southeastern United States are one of those archaeological stories that feels weirdly overlooked, considering how important they could be. Most people think English colonies were the first serious European footholds in the American Southeast. But decades before Jamestown, the Spanish were already pushing deep inland through what's now the Carolinas, Tennessee, and surrounding regions during the 1560s. And Juan Pardo was right in the middle of it. Pardo led expeditions from Santa Elena and established a chain of small forts across indigenous territories. The Spanish hoped these forts would secure trade routes, expand influence, and maybe even connect to rumored routes toward Mexico, which sounds ambitious enough already. But the creepy part is how completely most of these forts vanished afterward. Some were abandoned. Others were reportedly destroyed during indigenous uprisings after the Spanish left small garrisons behind. Written records mention forts like Fort San Juan and several others. But for centuries, historians had little idea where most of them actually stood. And these weren't giant stone castles either. They were usually wooden frontier forts built quickly in unfamiliar territory, meaning after 450 years, they can disappear almost completely into the landscape. That's why modern archaeology has been so obsessed with locating them. A few discoveries have happened already, including evidence tied to Fort San Juan in North Carolina, but many sites are still missing. And honestly, every new find completely changes how people understand early American history. There's something surreal about realizing Spanish soldiers were building forts deep in the Appalachian region, generations before the English even established permanent colonies farther north. Somewhere beneath forests, farms, and small southern towns, there are probably still buried traces of forgotten Spanish outposts most people have never even heard of. Story 15. The story surrounding the original Coyolxauhqui stone is exactly the kind of thing that fuels endless archaeological rumors in Mexico City. The stone itself is one of the most important surviving artifacts connected to the Templo Mayor, the massive ceremonial center of ancient Tenochtitlan before the Spanish conquest. And honestly, the fact that modern Mexico City is built directly on top of the old Aztec capital makes everything feel even stranger. The Coyolxauhqui stone was rediscovered in 1978 by electrical workers digging underground, which basically kicked off huge new excavations around the Templo Mayor ruins. The carving is enormous and depicts the dismembered moon goddess Coyolxauhqui after her defeat by the god Huitzilopochtli. It's one of the defining pieces of Aztec civilization. But there's been this persistent rumor for years that the real original isn't actually the one most visitors see publicly, and that what's displayed are replicas while the authentic artifact is stored elsewhere under extreme protection. Honestly, it's not even that crazy sounding. Governments and museums absolutely do hide or heavily restrict access to important artifacts all the time for preservation, security, politics, or conservation reasons. Especially in a place like Mexico City, where archaeological discoveries are constantly happening underneath one of the largest cities on Earth. The really wild part is imagining how much still remains buried there. Entire temples, tunnels, offerings, royal burials, sculptures, and ceremonial chambers are probably still sitting beneath streets, churches, and colonial buildings because the Spanish literally built over the ruins of Tenochtitlan. So the idea that major Mesoamerican artifacts could exist in restricted vaults or hidden storage areas honestly feels less like conspiracy and more like inevitability. Story 16, the lost tomb of Alaric I, sounds almost mythological because the burial story is so dramatic, it barely feels real. After Alaric famously sacked Rome in 410 AD, his forces supposedly left the city carrying enormous amounts of treasure, gold, silver, religious artifacts, and priceless spoils taken from one of the richest places in the ancient world. Then shortly afterward, Alaric died unexpectedly in southern Italy. According to legend, the Visigoths buried him with part of the treasure beneath the bed of a river. And the way they supposedly did it is insane. Ancient accounts claim the Visigoths temporarily diverted the course of the Busento River near modern-day Cosenza, dug a tomb in the dry riverbed, buried Alaric along with treasure and war spoils, then redirected the river back over the grave to hide it forever. Then, just to make sure nobody could reveal the location, the workers involved were supposedly killed, which, if true, worked unbelievably well. More than 1,600 years later, nobody has ever conclusively found Alaric's tomb or the treasure buried with him, and people have searched constantly. Historians, archaeologists, treasure hunters, everybody. The creepy part is that the tomb could genuinely still exist underground, somewhere beneath layers of river sediment, untouched since late antiquity. And considering the timing, there's always speculation about what might actually be inside. Roman treasure, imperial artifacts, weapons, religious relics carried out during the sack of Rome itself. Honestly, there's something weirdly cinematic about the whole story. One of the men responsible for helping bring down the Western Roman world, buried beneath a hidden river tomb filled with stolen Roman treasure, while history slowly forgot exactly where it happened. Story 17. The possibility that Nefertiti could still be hidden behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb is honestly one of the coolest archaeological theories in decades, because it sounds exactly like the setup for an ancient curse movie. Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings was already one of the greatest discoveries in history when it was opened in 1922. But compared to other royal tombs, it's actually weirdly small and cramped for a pharaoh. That's where the theory starts. Some researchers think Tut may have died unexpectedly so young that he was buried quickly inside a tomb originally intended for someone else, possibly Nefertiti herself. Radar scans and wall anomalies inside the tomb have even sparked speculation about hidden chambers still sealed behind the painted walls. And if one of those chambers belongs to Nefertiti, that would be absolutely massive. Nefertiti is one of the most famous women from the ancient world, but her burial place has never been conclusively identified. She basically disappears from the historical record after the Amarna period, which already makes her feel mysterious. Then there's the burial mask issue. Some scholars noticed evidence suggesting parts of Tut's famous golden mask may originally have been made for someone else. The name Neferneferuaten, appearing in certain contexts, fueled theories that items were repurposed from a royal burial associated with Nefertiti, who may have used that throne name. Nobody knows for sure, obviously. But honestly, the thought that one of the most important queens in Egyptian history could still be resting untouched in a hidden chamber literally meters away from one of the most visited tombs on Earth is just insane to think about. Story 18. Honestly, that's one of the creepiest and coolest things about places like Ohio. People forget the region is absolutely packed with ancient Native American earthworks, burial mounds, and ceremonial sites, many of them thousands of years old, and a lot probably still haven't been officially documented. Cultures like the Hopewell culture and Adena culture built enormous mound complexes across Ohio long before Europeans arrived. Some were burial sites, others ceremonial centers, astronomical alignments, geometric earthworks, or gathering places tied to trade and ritual activity. The wild part is how easy some of them are to miss now. After centuries of farming, erosion, logging, suburban development, and road construction, a lot of smaller mounds just look like weird hills or natural rises in the terrain unless you know what you're looking for. LiDAR surveys have been huge recently because they can reveal subtle earthworks hidden beneath forests or blended into landscapes people thought were completely ordinary. And honestly, there are probably way more out there than official records show. Especially on private land, nobody's surveyed carefully. The unsettling thing is realizing how much history can disappear in plain sight. Someone could literally mow grass over a 2,000-year-old ceremonial site for decades without realizing what's underneath. What gets me is imagining how alive those landscapes once were. Fires burning on the mounds, ceremonies happening at night, trade routes connecting distant regions, generations of people gathering at places that now just look like random wooded hillsides. Then modern life rolls over everything, and the memory fades. So, the fact that people still occasionally stumble across undocumented sites today honestly doesn't surprise me at all. Story 19. The amount of missing art from World War II is honestly so enormous that historians are pretty much certain there are still hidden caches out there waiting to be discovered. During the war, German forces systematically looted museums, private collections, churches, castles, and entire cities across Europe. Paintings, sculptures, gold, manuscripts, religious artifacts, basically anything valuable or culturally important got packed onto trains and hidden in mines, bunkers, caves, and remote estates as the war collapsed. And even after decades of recovery efforts, thousands of pieces are still missing. Every few years, somebody stumbles onto another hidden collection in some forgotten basement or sealed storage room. There was even that huge discovery in Munich in 2012, where authorities found over 1,000 artworks hidden in an apartment belonging to the son of a dealer connected to wartime looting. So, honestly, there's almost certainly more out there. The really creepy thought is that some masterpieces might still be sitting behind collapsed tunnel walls, buried in alpine bunkers, or hidden inside private collections where nobody even realizes what they own. Then there's the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum theft, which somehow feels even stranger because it happened so recently. In 1990, two guys dressed as police officers walked into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum and stole 13 artworks, including pieces by Rembrandt and Vermeer. And they were never recovered. That's the insane part. Some of the most famous stolen artworks on Earth have just been gone for over 30 years. No museum-quality paintings randomly surface on the black market because they're too recognizable to sell openly. So, where are they? Hidden in private vaults? Destroyed? Sitting in organized crime storage somewhere? Nobody knows. It's weirdly unsettling that priceless pieces of human history can simply disappear like that and stay missing for generations. Story 20. Honestly, a Bronze Age Greek shipwreck preserved in the Black Sea would probably become one of the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made. The Black Sea is kind of insane from an archaeology perspective because its deep waters are almost completely oxygen-free. That means wood-eating organisms that normally destroy shipwrecks can't really survive down there. So, instead of ships rotting away into nothing, wrecks can remain unbelievably intact for thousands of years. And we already know this actually happens. Marine archaeologists have found ancient ships in the Black Sea with masts, rudders, ropes, and structural details still preserved after centuries underwater. Some look almost like they sank yesterday. Now imagine finding one from the Bronze Age. Not a later Greek or Roman ship, but something from the era of Mycenaean Greece, Trojan War legends, or the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BC. A ship like that could completely change what we know about ancient trade, seafaring, and Mediterranean connections. Because the frustrating thing about Bronze Age civilizations is how little direct evidence survives. Most ships from that period were wood, which normally disappears completely. We mostly reconstruct ancient trade networks from scattered cargo finds or coastal ruins. But an intact wreck? That could preserve tools, weapons, pottery, cargo, food remains, writing tablets, maybe even personal belongings from sailors who lived over 3,000 years ago. Honestly, it would basically be a time capsule from a world sitting right on the edge between myth and recorded history. And the Black Sea genuinely feels like one of the few places on Earth where something like that could still survive untouched at the bottom, waiting for somebody to find it. Story 21, that's honestly one of the most frustrating types of archaeological mystery to me, when something was definitely discovered, partially documented, and then somehow just lost again. Especially in Egypt, where early archaeology in the 1800s was often chaotic as hell. Back then, a lot of excavations were basically treasure hunts with minimal documentation by modern standards. People removed statues, false doors, sarcophagi, inscriptions, whatever looked important, then left incomplete maps or vague notes behind. So, the idea of a gigantic Old Kingdom vizier tomb disappearing again honestly sounds completely plausible. And if the false door survived and ended up in a museum somewhere, then the tomb absolutely existed. Those things were incredibly important in elite Egyptian burials because they symbolically allowed the spirit of the dead to pass between worlds. They usually carried inscriptions naming the owner and listing titles, which is probably how historians know the tomb belonged to a major official. What makes it fascinating is the scale you mentioned. During the Old Kingdom of Egypt, viziers were basically the highest-ranking officials beneath the pharaoh himself. But if this tomb was unusually massive even by elite standards, that raises all kinds of questions about how powerful or politically important this individual actually was. And honestly, Egypt is filled with partially lost archaeology like this. Sand shifts, excavation records vanish, urban expansion covers sites. Some tomb entrances collapse or get reburied naturally over time. There are probably entire elite necropolises still hidden beneath desert layers, because early archaeologists either couldn't relocate them properly or documented them terribly. The creepy part is imagining this enormous tomb still sitting underground somewhere, sealed and forgotten again after briefly re-entering history 150 years ago. Story 22, The Mystery of the Ark of the Covenant, is one of those historical rabbit holes where mythology, religion, archaeology, and conspiracy theories all collide together. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Ark was basically the most sacred object in ancient Israel, a gold-covered chest said to contain the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. The descriptions make it sound almost supernatural. Armies carried it into battle. People believed it held divine power. Entire stories revolve around what happened when someone touched it improperly. And then, at some point, it vanished. Most historians think it likely disappeared during the Babylonian sack of Jerusalem around 586 BC. After that, there's no universally accepted historical record of what became of it. That's where the theories start getting wild. One of the most famous claims is that the Ark ended up in Axum, inside the Church of St. Mary of Zion. Ethiopian tradition says the Ark was brought there centuries ago and has been guarded ever since by a single dedicated monk who supposedly never leaves its side. The weird part is that almost nobody is allowed to examine it. No carbon dating, no public scientific analysis, no major archaeological verification. People basically just have to accept the claim on faith. And honestly, even if access were granted tomorrow, it probably wouldn't end the arguments anyway. If the object turned out ancient, people would debate whether it was the Ark or just an old ceremonial chest. If it turned out younger, believers would reject the testing. Still, the idea that one of history's most legendary religious artifacts could theoretically be sitting inside a guarded church, while the rest of the world debates whether it even existed, is kind of fascinating. Story 23. Honestly, the idea of another Göbekli Tepe level site sitting underwater somewhere is one of the few archaeological theories that feels less like fantasy and more like something we'll probably eventually confirm. People forget how different the world looked around 10,000 BC. Sea levels were dramatically lower during the last ice age. Huge areas that are underwater today were once dry land. Coastlines sat miles farther out, and entire regions where humans likely lived are now submerged beneath oceans and shallow seas. And humans almost always clustered around coastlines, rivers, and resource-rich areas, which means a massive amount of prehistoric human activity is probably underwater now. Göbekli Tepe already shattered people's assumptions about ancient societies. Before its discovery, a lot of archaeologists thought large-scale, organized religious or ceremonial construction only emerged after agriculture became established. Then suddenly there's this gigantic ritual complex built by hunter-gatherers over 11,000 years ago, with massive carved stone pillars and sophisticated symbolism. That realization changed everything. So now people naturally wonder, if that existed and stayed buried for millennia unnoticed, what else is still out there? And honestly, underwater archaeology barely scratches the surface compared to how enormous the oceans are. Sonar mapping constantly reveals submerged structures, ancient river systems, drowned forests, and old settlements off coastlines worldwide. The Black Sea, Mediterranean, Persian Gulf, Indian coastline, Doggerland near Britain. There are tons of places where prehistoric communities almost certainly existed before rising seas swallowed them. The creepy thing is imagining entire ceremonial centers or settlements preserved underwater in darkness for thousands of years while modern boats pass over them constantly without realizing what's below. There could genuinely be submerged prehistoric sites out there, capable of completely rewriting what we know about early civilization again. Story 24, The Lost Tomb of Attila the Hun, is one of those historical mysteries that feels almost too cinematic to be real. This was the guy Roman writers basically described as the terror of Europe itself. Entire cities panicked at rumors of his armies approaching. He helped destabilize the late Roman world so badly that even centuries later, his name still sounds ominous. And then after all that chaos, his grave completely vanished. According to the old accounts, when Attila died in 453 AD, the Huns buried him in a secret tomb along with enormous treasure and weapons. The burial story gets darker from there. Supposedly, he was placed inside 3 coffins, one of iron, one of silver, and one of gold, symbolizing his power, wealth, and life of conquest. Then, according to legend, a river was temporarily diverted so his grave could be hidden beneath the riverbed. After the burial, the water was allowed to flow back over the site, erasing all evidence. And just to make sure nobody could reveal the location, the workers involved were supposedly killed afterward, which, terrifyingly enough, may have actually worked. Nobody has conclusively found Attila's tomb in over 1,500 years. And honestly, the scary part is that it could still genuinely exist somewhere untouched beneath layers of sediment in Eastern Europe. If the burial stories are even partly true, the grave could contain incredible artifacts from the Hunnic Empire and the chaotic collapse of the Roman world. What makes it fascinating is how complete the disappearance was. Most great rulers leave behind giant monuments, tomb complexes, inscriptions, etc. Attila left fear, legends, and a grave so effectively hidden that history itself lost it. Story 25, The Lost Army of Cambyses II, is one of those ancient stories that sounds so unbelievable, people still argue over whether it actually happened. According to Herodotus, around 524 BC, Cambyses sent a massive, Persian force, supposedly around 50,000 soldiers, across Egypt's western desert toward the Siwa oasis. The mission was supposedly punishment. The priests at the Oracle of Amun had either insulted Cambyses or refused to acknowledge his authority, depending on which version you read. So, he sends this huge army into one of the harshest environments on Earth, and then they vanish completely. Herodotus claims the soldiers were engulfed by a gigantic sandstorm somewhere deep in the Sahara and buried alive beneath the dunes. No survivors, no confirmed remains, nothing. Which honestly sounds like the world's most dramatic way for an army to disappear. But the creepy part is that deserts absolutely can erase things frighteningly well. Entire settlements, caravans, and trade routes have vanished beneath shifting sand over time. And Egypt's western desert is enormous. There are still places out there that barely anyone visits even now. People have searched for the army for centuries. Every few years, somebody claims they found bones, bronze weapon, thumbs, in campsites or artifacts tied to the Persians, but nothing has ever fully proven the story. And honestly, even if Herodotus exaggerated the numbers, there's a decent chance some expedition really did disappear out there. The unsettling thing is imagining thousands of soldiers marching into endless desert heat 2,500 years ago and simply never coming back, while their remains may still lie buried beneath the Sahara, waiting for a sand dune to shift in exactly the right way. Story 26, The Lost Ruins of Akkad, are honestly one of the craziest unsolved archaeological mysteries because this wasn't some tiny forgotten desert village. This was the capital of the Akkadian Empire, arguably the world's first true empire, created by Sargon of Akkad over 4,000 years ago. And nobody knows where the city is. That part genuinely blows my mind. Ancient Mesopotamian texts mention Akkad constantly. Kings bragged about conquering it. Trade records reference it. Later civilizations treated it like this legendary center of power and culture. It was hugely important historically. But the actual physical city? Gone. Archaeologists have searched for it for generations, somewhere in modern-day Iraq, usually near the Tigris or Euphrates rivers. But no site has ever been conclusively identified as Akkad itself. And honestly, Mesopotamia is kind of the perfect place for an entire city to disappear. Rivers constantly changed course over thousands of years. Flooding buried settlements under thick sediment. New civilizations built directly on top of older ones over and over again. Plus, modern wars, looting, and political instability have made large-scale archaeology in Iraq incredibly difficult for decades. The eerie part is that Akkad is probably still there somewhere underground. Like there could literally be palace ruins, temples, archives, inscriptions, entire streets from humanity's first empire sitting beneath farmland or desert right now while nobody realizes it. And if archaeologists ever definitively found it, the amount of information it could reveal about the birth of organized empire, early writing, trade, warfare, and government would be absolutely massive. It's weird thinking one of the most historically important cities ever built has effectively been swallowed by time itself. Story 27, the story of the missing nuclear bomb core off the United States coast, is one of those Cold War incidents that sounds way too insane to be real until you realize it actually happened more than once. During the Cold War, the US military lost multiple nuclear weapons in accidents known as broken arrow incidents. Planes crashed, bombs fell into oceans, submarines sank, equipment malfunctioned, and in some cases, the weapons were never fully recovered. One of the creepiest examples happened in 1958 near Georgia after a collision between a bomber and a fighter jet. To prevent the aircraft from crashing, a Mark 15 hydrogen bomb was jettisoned into the waters near Tybee Island, and despite searches, it was never conclusively recovered. That alone is horrifying enough. But what really gets people is the uncertainty surrounding whether certain missing weapons contained fully functional nuclear cores or not. Official statements over the years have sometimes been contradictory, vague, or disputed by former military personnel. So, you end up with this deeply unsettling possibility. Somewhere beneath mud, sediment, and dark coastal water, parts of a Cold War nuclear weapon could still be sitting there decades later. And honestly, the ocean is huge. Once something sinks into mud underwater, especially in coastal areas with shifting sediment and low visibility, recovering it becomes unbelievably difficult. The eerie thing is how casually some of these incidents were handled compared to how catastrophic they sound now. During the Cold War, nuclear weapons were transported constantly by aircraft and submarines all over the world. Accidents were statistically inevitable, which means there are probably still lost military objects, radioactive material, wreckage, maybe even entire weapons, sitting undiscovered on the seafloor right now, while fishing boats and cargo ships pass overhead every day, completely unaware. Story 28, the Battle of Mobila, is one of those moments in early American history that honestly deserves way more attention because it was basically a nightmare scenario for the Spanish. Most people grow up hearing stories about conquistadors steamrolling everyone they encountered, but Mobila was very different. In 1540, Hernando de Soto and his expedition marched into a heavily fortified indigenous settlement somewhere in present-day Alabama called Mobila. At first, everything looked relatively peaceful, but the whole thing was apparently a trap orchestrated by the local leader, Tuscaloosa. And once fighting started, it turned into absolute chaos. Contemporary accounts describe indigenous warriors pouring out from hidden positions, barricades sealing exits, buildings catching fire, and brutal close-quarters combat lasting for hours. The Spanish eventually won in the technical sense because they held the field afterward, but one is doing a lot of work there. De Soto's expedition got wrecked. They lost huge amounts of supplies, horses, weapons, armor, and manpower. Some estimates suggest thousands of indigenous fighters died too, making it one of the bloodiest battles ever fought between Europeans and Native Americans in North America. And the crazy part? Nobody knows exactly where Mobila was. Archaeologists have spent decades trying to find the site because if it's ever conclusively identified, it could contain incredible evidence from the battle: burned fortifications, Spanish artifacts, weapons, human remains, horse equipment, all frozen in one catastrophic moment from 1540. Honestly, it's kind of satisfying historically because Mobila shattered the myth that early European expeditions were unstoppable. The local indigenous societies absolutely could and did inflict devastating damage when they coordinated effectively. Somewhere beneath forests or farmland in Alabama, there's probably still a battlefield where conquistadors learned that lesson the hard way. Story 29. The Hittite Empire was one of the major superpowers of the Bronze Age alongside Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. These guys fought pharaohs, signed some of the world's earliest peace treaties, and controlled huge parts of what's now Turkey and the Near East. And yet one of their major royal cities basically disappeared. Ancient texts describe Tar-Hintasa as massively important during parts of Hittite history. At one point, the royal court may have even relocated there temporarily. Kings issued decrees from it. Political struggles centered around it. Entire regions were governed through it. But archaeologists still aren't completely sure where it actually was. That's the insane part. Researchers think it was somewhere in southern Turkey, possibly buried beneath later settlements, farmland, or unexplored terrain. There are candidate sites, but nothing universally accepted as the Tarhuntasa yet. And honestly, the Hittites in general still feel weirdly mysterious compared to Egypt or Rome. For centuries, people barely even knew they existed until archaeologists started uncovering their cities and cuneiform tablets in the 1800s. Before that, this entire major empire had basically faded into near myth. So the idea that one of their major capitals could still be sitting underground untouched somewhere is completely believable. The really creepy thing is imagining archives still buried there. Clay tablets, royal records, diplomatic correspondence, religious texts, maybe even first-hand accounts from the Bronze Age collapse itself, one of the biggest civilization disasters in ancient history. A discovery like that could completely reshape what historians know about the Hittites and the collapse of the ancient world around 1200 BC. Story 30. The disappearance of Goro-Nyudo, Masamune's greatest swords, is one of those historical mysteries that feels almost mythical at this point. Masamune wasn't just a swordsmith. In Japan, he's basically treated like the absolute pinnacle of sword making. His blades became legendary for their craftsmanship, beauty, and supposed quality in battle. Over centuries, specific Masamune swords developed names, histories, owners, and reputations, almost like they were famous people themselves. And then a bunch of them vanished. The most famous missing example is probably the Honjo Masamune, which became a symbol of the Tokugawa shogunate for generations. It survived wars, political upheaval, and centuries of Japanese history. Then World War II ended. After Japan's surrender, occupying authorities ordered many weapons surrendered, including historically important swords. The Honjo Masamune was reportedly handed over at a police station in Tokyo in 1945, and then completely disappeared. Nobody knows what happened after that. Maybe it was taken home by an American serviceman who had no idea what it was. Maybe it sits forgotten in a private collection somewhere. Maybe it was destroyed accidentally. Maybe somebody still owns it right now without realizing they possess one of the most famous swords in Japanese history. And honestly, that possibility is what makes the whole thing so fascinating. There are probably still historically important Japanese blades scattered around the world, undocumented or misidentified, because post-war chaos displaced so many artifacts. A sword worth millions, historically and culturally, could theoretically be hanging in somebody's basement or attic right now, looking like an old samurai sword. The creepy part is realizing how easily priceless history can just vanish during war and occupation. One of the greatest weapons ever crafted may still exist somewhere quietly gathering dust, while the world wonders where it went. Story 31. The Lost Kingdom connected to the eruption of Mount Tambora, or possibly older legends surrounding volcanic catastrophes in Indonesia. But the darkened skies worldwide detail especially points people toward another infamous event, the massive eruption of Mount Semmelus in the 1200s. That eruption was absolutely apocalyptic. Scientists think it may have been one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the last several thousand years. Ash and sulfur blasted into the atmosphere. Global temperatures dropped. Crop failures spread across parts of the world, and historical records from Europe and Asia describe strange weather, darkened skies, famine, and bizarre atmospheric effects afterward. And here's where it gets creepy. Ancient Indonesian texts describe a kingdom destroyed by the eruption, often linked to a place called Pamatan on Lombok Island. According to the chronicles, entire settlements with palaces, houses, temples, and carved stone structures were obliterated beneath volcanic debris almost instantly, which immediately makes people think of Pompeii. Because if the accounts are accurate, there could genuinely be buried medieval Indonesian cities preserved beneath volcanic deposits waiting to be excavated. And unlike Pompeii, these sites are barely known internationally. That's what makes the whole thing fascinating. Southeast Asia has huge stretches of history that are still poorly understood archaeologically compared to places like Rome or Egypt. Entire kingdoms rose and vanished with limited surviving records. So the possibility that a fully buried stone city from a forgotten Indonesian kingdom still exists beneath volcanic ash honestly feels very plausible. And if archaeologists ever uncover it intact, it could become one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in Asia. Story 32. The lost altar treasures from Constantinople are one of those historical rabbit holes where the deeper you go, the crazier it gets. During the Fourth Crusade, Crusaders and Venetian forces absolutely devastated Constantinople. Instead of continuing toward the Holy Land, they ended up looting the richest Christian city on earth. Churches, palaces, monasteries, relic chambers, libraries, basically everything valuable got stripped apart. And the amount of treasure taken was supposedly unbelievable. Gold altars, jeweled reliquaries, sacred icons, statues, manuscripts, silver church fittings, ancient Roman artifacts, entire shiploads of priceless Byzantine wealth were hauled out of the city. A lot of it was sent toward Venice because Venice played a huge role in the crusade itself. But here's the eerie part. Not every ship made it. There are long-standing stories and theories about treasure vessels sinking in storms or disappearing during transport across the Mediterranean or Adriatic. And considering medieval shipping conditions, that's honestly extremely believable. Ships overloaded with loot crossing rough seas. Disaster waiting to happen. So, historians have speculated for centuries that parts of Byzantium's stolen treasures may still be sitting underwater somewhere. And if true, we're not talking about random coins. We could be talking about lost altars from ancient churches, relics from Constantinople's greatest cathedrals, imperial treasures, sacred objects from the Byzantine world that vanished during one of the most catastrophic sacks in medieval history. The creepy thing is that the Mediterranean is full of undiscovered wrecks already. Entire ancient cargo ships have been found perfectly preserved underwater centuries later. So somewhere beneath dark Mediterranean waters, there really could be shipwrecks carrying pieces of Byzantium that nobody has touched since 1204. Story 33. The Lost Port City of Muziris. Honestly sounds like something out of fantasy once you realize how important it supposedly was. For centuries, Muziri sat on the Malabar coast of southern India and acted as one of the biggest trade hubs in the entire Indian Ocean world. Roman ships sailed there for spices. Arab merchants traded there. Persian, Egyptian, African, and Chinese traders passed through constantly. This place was basically a globalized civilization over 1,000 years before modern globalization existed. Ancient Roman writers were obsessed with it. Pliny the Elder called it the first emporium of India, and Roman records complain endlessly about how much gold was flowing out of the empire because Romans were addicted to Indian luxuries like black pepper. And honestly, the city must have been incredible at its peak. Imagine crowded harbor markets filled with ships from across Afro-Eurasia. Sailors speak dozens of languages. Hindu temples standing near early churches, mosques, Buddhist influences, Jewish communities, and foreign merchant districts. Spices, ivory, silk, gems, incense, wine, glassware, all flowing through one place. Then nature basically erased it. In 1341 CE, catastrophic floods dramatically altered the coastline and river systems of Kerala. Ports shifted, waterways changed course, and Muziris seems to have collapsed almost overnight, as trade routes reorganized around newer harbors like Kochi. And the truly eerie part is that archaeologists still aren't entirely certain where the full city was. Sites like Patna may represent parts of ancient Muziris, but huge portions could still be buried under sediment, flooded river plains, or coastal deposits left by the disaster. It's honestly wild to think one of the greatest trade cities on Earth could just vanish beneath mud and changing waterways, while history slowly forgot where it even stood. Story 34. The mystery surrounding the missing Neolithic central sites in Falbygden is one of those archaeological problems that sounds niche at first, but the more you read about it, the stranger it becomes. Falbygden is absolutely loaded with prehistoric remains. We're talking megalithic tombs, passage graves, settlements, ritual landscapes, and evidence of dense farming communities going back thousands of years. It's one of the richest Neolithic regions in Sweden. And yet, archaeologists still struggle with a weird question. Where are the actual major central gathering places that should logically tie all of this together? That's what makes the area fascinating. Based on the number of tombs and surrounding activity, there should have been major ceremonial, political, or social centers somewhere in the landscape. Places where people gathered seasonally, traded, held rituals, coordinated labor, buried elites, something. But the evidence feels strangely fragmented, and honestly, that creates this eerie feeling that either archaeologists are missing something fundamental, or the central sites existed in forms we don't fully recognize yet. Part of the issue is preservation. A lot of Neolithic architecture in Scandinavia was timber-based or earthwork-heavy, meaning after 5,000 years, it can become nearly invisible unless conditions are perfect. Farming, forestry, erosion, and later settlement patterns may also have wiped out or obscured key locations. LiDAR and newer survey technologies are helping a lot, though. That's the exciting part. Modern archaeology is increasingly finding subtle landscape modifications, hidden structures, and forgotten alignments that older methods completely missed. So, honestly, it feels less like the sites never existed, and more like they're still hiding in plain sight somewhere beneath fields, forests, or later activity. And if they are eventually identified, they could completely reshape how people understand Neolithic society in Scandinavia. Story 35. The idea of finding a fully or partially mummified Neanderthal preserved in Siberian permafrost would probably be one of the biggest paleoanthropological discoveries in history. Most Neanderthal remains we have right now are fragmentary. Bones, teeth, partial skeletons, scattered remains in caves. Scientists can learn a lot from them, but soft tissue preservation is incredibly rare. Permafrost changes everything. Places in Siberia preserve things unbelievably well under the right conditions. Mammoths have been found with fur, skin, stomach contents, even preserved blood and muscle tissue. Ancient wolves, cave lion cubs, and Ice Age animals have basically emerged looking like they died yesterday. So naturally people wonder, what if there's a Neanderthal out there too? And honestly, it's not impossible at all. Neanderthals and other archaic humans absolutely lived across cold Eurasian environments during the Ice Age. If one died in exactly the right conditions, rapid freezing, low oxygen, stable permafrost, there's a chance soft tissue could survive far better than normal. The scientific value would be insane. Skin, hair, eye structure, internal organs, maybe even preserved proteins or intact DNA far beyond anything currently available. We could potentially learn what Neanderthals actually looked like in much greater detail instead of relying mostly on reconstructions from bones. And the creepy part is that climate change is starting to thaw ancient permafrost all across the Arctic, which means things hidden for tens of thousands of years are literally beginning to emerge from the ground now. That's what makes the whole idea feel so eerie. Somewhere in frozen Siberia, there could genuinely be an Ice Age human relative still preserved beneath the earth, waiting for the permafrost to finally give it back. Story 36, the Herculaneum papyri, are honestly one of the most exciting archaeological discoveries on Earth right now because they feel like humanity is slowly unlocking a library that's been sealed since the Roman Empire. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, places like Herculaneum were buried under volcanic material almost instantly. Inside one massive villa, archaeologists later discovered hundreds of ancient scrolls. The problem? They were carbonized into fragile black lumps that looked more like burnt logs than books. For centuries, trying to open them physically often destroyed them completely. So people knew there were potentially lost ancient texts inside, but couldn't actually read most of them. And that's where things get crazy recently. Modern imaging technology and AI-assisted analysis are finally allowing researchers to virtually unwrap the scrolls without physically opening them. They're literally scanning inside the carbonized papyri and reconstructing hidden writing digitally, which means humanity may be recovering texts nobody has read for nearly 2,000 years. That's honestly insane to think about. And yeah, one scroll apparently helped narrow down information related to Plato's burial place. But that's probably just the beginning. The real excitement is the possibility that the unopened scrolls could contain completely lost works from ancient philosophers, historians, playwrights, or scientists. Entire books vanished from antiquity all the time. We know famous authors wrote works that simply disappeared over the centuries. So, buried under volcanic ash since the Roman era, there may literally be unread pieces of classical civilization waiting inside those scrolls. It's kind of surreal that one volcanic eruption accidentally preserved a hidden library long enough for future technology to finally unlock it. Story 37, archaeology is right on the edge of completely rewriting parts of early human history in both the Americas and the Near East. For decades, the standard story about the peoples of the Americas was pretty rigid, basically Clovis first, with humans arriving around 13,000 years ago. But newer discoveries and technologies have been steadily wrecking that timeline. Sites like White Sands National Park and others are pushing possible human presence much earlier than people were comfortable accepting before. And the frustrating part is how sparse the evidence still is. A lot of the earliest coastal settlements may now be underwater because sea levels rose massively after the Ice Age. Organic material rarely survives well. Ancient camps could have been tiny and mobile. So there's this feeling that the truly game-changing site probably still hasn't been found yet. A rich preserved site with human remains and recoverable DNA would be absolutely huge, especially if it came from a very early context. Genetic material could answer enormous questions about migration waves, population mixing, and how the first Americans spread across the continents. Then there's Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding Tepe sites, which honestly feel just as revolutionary. People still underestimate how weird Göbekli Tepe is. The misconception that the artistic and technical sophistication declined afterward oversimplifies everything massively. Researchers like Lee Clare and Jens Notroff have pointed out that the broader ritual landscape is way more complex than people think. So, if nearby smaller sites turn out older, contemporary, or later than Göbekli, every possibility creates interesting implications. Either Göbekli wasn't unique at all, or social organization shifted in ways we don't fully understand yet. And honestly, that's the exciting part. It increasingly feels like we're still missing enormous chapters of early civilization. Story 38. The idea that Pompeii and nearby sites could still contain unread texts is one of the most exciting things happening in archaeology right now. For a long time, people assumed a huge amount of ancient literature was simply gone forever. Fires, wars, decay, moisture, time, entire libraries vanished across antiquity. Then archaeologists discovered carbonized scrolls at places like Herculaneum, and suddenly there was this terrifying realization. The texts might still physically exist, we just couldn't read them. That's what makes modern technology so crazy here. A lot of these scrolls are basically burnt solid. If you try to open them physically, they crumble apart instantly. For centuries, they were almost treated like decorative charcoal lumps because nobody knew what else to do. Now researchers are using advanced scanning, X-ray imaging, machine learning, and AI-assisted reconstruction to read ink hidden inside the rolled papyrus without unwrapping it, which honestly feels like science fiction. Human beings are literally recovering writing from sealed scrolls buried by a volcanic eruption nearly 2,000 years ago. And the implications are enormous because Roman literature survives only in fragments already. We know famous ancient authors wrote countless works that disappeared completely over time. Histories, plays, philosophical texts, scientific discussions, poetry, all potentially lost forever. Except maybe not. That's the eerie part. There could genuinely be unread works from antiquity still sitting inside sealed scrolls, waiting for imaging technology to improve enough to extract them. Entire books nobody has seen since the Roman Empire could theoretically reappear almost overnight. And Pompeii area excavations keep producing surprises constantly anyway. New graffiti, inscription, rooms, paintings, shrines, human stories. It really feels like Vesuvius accidentally created a time capsule that modern technology is only now finally learning how to unlock properly. Story 39. We're going to discover way more branches of the human family tree, eventually. The crazy part is how fragmentary the fossil record already is. Entire species have been identified from a few teeth, a jaw fragment, or partial skull pieces. Then suddenly somebody finds a better skeleton decades later and everything changes again. Take Sahelanthropus chidensis or Auroran tuganensis. These are already pushing incredibly deep into early human evolution, around 6 to 7 million years ago, near the possible split between humans and chimpanzees. And honestly, there's no reason to think they were the only lineages around. Evolution doesn't work neatly. There were probably tons of overlapping ape species, failed branches, isolated populations, and weird evolutionary experiments scattered across Africa and Eurasia that left little or no fossil trace. We're probably getting a hilariously incomplete picture. The Denisovans alone proved that. Scientists basically discovered an entire human group from tiny bone fragments and DNA. Imagine how many other lineages existed that we simply haven't sampled yet. Then there's Gigantopithecus, which honestly feels almost mythical at this point. The fact that we know this massive ape existed mostly from teeth and jaw fragments is insane. This thing may have stood around 10 feet tall and weighed hundreds of kilograms. Yet we still don't have a complete skeleton. And somewhere in caves or sediment deposits across Asia, there's probably a decent chance one still exists waiting to be found. That's the creepy and exciting part about paleoanthropology. Human evolution increasingly looks less like a straight line and more like a tangled jungle filled with forgotten relatives. And every few years, somebody digs up another piece of bone that suddenly reminds us how much of our own story is still buried underground.